The wind carried her name like a dying breath through the pines, syllables stretched thin across impossible distance. Kate Morrison stopped mid-stride, pack swaying against her spine, leather straps creaking in the mountain silence that followed. 3 years of isolation had taught her to trust her instincts above all else, and every nerve in her body screamed that something fundamental had shifted in the wilderness she called home. The voice hadn't belonged to anything human. Her fingers found the knife at her belt, worn bone handle fitting perfectly against calluses earned through countless nights in these Colorado peaks. The forest felt wrong today, emptied of its usual rhythms. No birdsong threaded through the evergreens. No squirrels chattered warnings at her passage. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath between gusts, waiting for something Kate couldn't name. Memory crashed through her defenses without permission. Her hand, younger and steadier, signing resignation papers across polished mahogany. The Genesis Biotech logo embossed in silver at the page's header. Her fingers trembling as ink bled across her name, sealing the end of everything she'd worked to build. Dr. Vincent Cross, watching from across the desk, smile cold as surgical steel, already knowing she wouldn't walk through those glass doors again without consequence. The present snapped back into focus as another sound reached her through the trees. Labored breathing, something massive struggling against restraints. The kind of desperate, animal panic that preceded death by inches rather than mercy. Kate pushed through a wall of frost-bent branches and stopped breathing entirely. The creature slumped against the lodgepole pine should have existed only in campfire stories parents used to keep children from wandering too deep into wild places. Easily 8 feet tall, even in its collapsed state. Shoulders broader than any man she'd encountered, covered in matted fur dark enough to swallow light. 3 ropes bit deep into thick wrists and ankles, professional knots securing it to the trunk with surgical precision. Her scientist's mind cataloged details even as her pulse hammered against her ribs. The ropes weren't hunter's cord. Military-grade synthetic fiber, UV-resistant, rated for loads exceeding 2,000 pounds. But what froze her marrow was the logo stamped into the metal buckles, cinching each knot tight. Genesis Biotech. The company she'd abandoned 3 years ago had found her wilderness sanctuary and left their signature branded into living flesh. Kate crept closer, boots crunching frost that had survived into late morning shadow. The creature's breathing rattled wet and shallow, ribs expanding with visible effort beneath matted fur. Blood crusted black around rope burns where restraints had sawed through skin for what must have been hours, maybe days. Someone had tied this being here and walked away, letting exposure and dehydration finish what cruelty had started. Her knee touched frozen ground as she knelt beside the massive form. Up close, the fur showed patterns she'd only seen in classified documents locked in Genesis vaults. Genetic markers indicating species hybridization that shouldn't exist outside controlled laboratory conditions. Her pulse shifted from fear into something colder, more surgical. She reached toward the nearest rope, and the creature's eyes snapped open. Not animal rage burning behind those pupils, not the blank instinct of a predator registering prey. Intelligence swam through pain-clouded depths, measuring her with the kind of assessment Kate recognized from mirror reflections during her darkest nights. This being knew suffering intimately and expected no mercy from creatures wearing human shapes. Kate's hand hovered over the rope as recognition slammed through her chest like voltage. The creature's left shoulder bore scarring in a pattern she'd committed to memory years ago, back when her hands had drawn genetic blueprints on digital screens and thought she was building medical miracles instead of living weapons. A001, Subject Alpha, the first stable cryptid human hybrid synthesis. The design she'd protested. The experiment Cross had insisted would revolutionize regenerative medicine. The abomination she'd walked away from before watching it achieve consciousness in some sterile Genesis laboratory. Her throat closed around words that wouldn't form. She'd told herself that leaving Genesis meant escaping complicity, that stealing encrypted files and vanishing into wilderness absolved her of responsibility for whatever horrors followed. The marking carved into this creature's flesh testified otherwise. She'd drawn the genetic architecture that made Subject Alpha possible. Her intellect, her research, her naive faith in Cross's promises had forged the chains binding this being to slow death in frozen mountains. The creature watched her internal collapse with something approaching understanding. One massive hand flexed against its restraints, not threatening, almost questioning, asking if she'd finish what others had started or prove herself different from the ones who'd left it here. Kate pulled the knife from her belt and set blade to rope. The first fiber parted with a sound like snapping vertebrae, tension releasing in increments that made her shoulders ache in sympathy. She worked methodically, sawing through layers while the creature held utterly still, conserving strength or perhaps surrendering to whatever fate she represented. When the rope finally split, the freed arm collapsed against frozen earth, muscles spasming from renewed circulation. She moved to the second restraint, fingers numb despite gloves, breath fogging between them in small clouds that dissipated before reaching the creature's face. The knots were identical to protocols she'd seen demonstrated during Genesis security briefings, back when Marcus Webb ran tactical operations and taught defensive procedures to research staff who asked too many questions about sample acquisition methods. Marcus, the man who'd helped her escape Genesis with stolen data and a 12-hour head start before Cross learned she'd copied every classified file in the genetics division. The mentor who'd warned her that people like Cross never stopped hunting assets they considered valuable enough to reclaim. The memory carried its own warning. If Marcus's knotwork secured Subject Alpha to this tree, either he'd been forced back into Genesis service, or something worse had compromised the only ally she'd trusted with her life. The third rope snapped and the creature sagged sideways, no longer held upright by restraints. Kate caught one massive shoulder, bracing against weight that should have crushed her, but instead settled with surprising gentleness. The being wasn't trying to overwhelm her. It was trusting her to bear what it could no longer carry alone. She fumbled for the canteen at her hip, unscrewing the cap with shaking fingers. Water poured over rope burns, washing away frozen blood in pink rivulets that steamed against still warm tissue. The creature flinched but didn't pull away, enduring cleansing fire the way it had endured everything else with grim patience. Kate's voice cracked when she finally managed speech. "Who did this to you?" The creature's eyes fixed on hers, and something impossible happened. Its throat worked, shaping sounds that approximated human speech through vocal cords never designed for language. The words emerged broken and wet, but unmistakable. "Kate, help, Emma." Every coherent thought evaporated. The creature knew her name, knew it well enough to shape syllables despite anatomy that should have made speech impossible, but the second name carried implications that froze her more thoroughly than mountain wind could ever accomplish. "Emma? Who's Emma?" Boot heels crunching frost answered before words could. Kate spun, knife raised, positioning herself between the creature and whoever approached through the trees. The man who stepped into the clearing moved with careful deliberation, hands visible and empty, posture deliberately non-threatening in ways only security professionals mastered. Marcus Webb looked 10 years older than their last meeting. Gray streaked through close-cropped hair, new lines carved deep around eyes that had witnessed too much and compartmentalized too little. The Genesis tactical vest over his jacket carried no company logo, but Kate recognized the gear from old briefings. He'd come prepared for conflict. His voice carried the same steady calm she remembered, though strain cracked through around the edges. "Kate Morrison, thank God, they have my daughter." Understanding crashed through her in waves that left her dizzy. "What? Marcus, I helped Atlas escape." He gestured toward the creature with one scarred hand. "Genesis took Emma as punishment. She's 12 years old, Kate. They kidnapped her from school 3 days ago." Kate's grip tightened on the knife handle until leather grip bit into her palm. The implications assembled themselves with sickening clarity. Genesis hadn't sent Marcus to recapture escaped assets. They'd taken his child and demanded he deliver Subject Alpha plus the geneticist who designed it, payment for crimes that amounted to basic human decency. They're using her as leverage. Cross made the offer personally. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Bring back Atlas and Kate Morrison within 72 hours. Emma gets released. Refuse and she disappears into the same black site holding the rest of the test subjects." The creature, Atlas, shifted beside Kate, drawing their attention. One massive hand moved with surprising dexterity, dragging through frost and pine needles to sketch crude shapes in the frozen ground. A small stick figure, clearly human and child-sized. 4 larger figures, built with the heavy proportions that marked Atlas's own form. Kate's breath caught. Your family. Genesis has them too. Atlas nodded slowly, eyes holding hers with intensity that transcended language barriers. The being wasn't just confirming facts. It was establishing connection, making clear that they shared something beyond immediate crisis. Both had loved ones held hostage by the same corporate machine that reduced living beings to experimental subjects and inventory line items. Marcus crouched beside the rough drawing, studying it with professional assessment before meeting Kate's gaze. After you left, Project Genesis escalated. Cross convinced the board to expand from theoretical research into live trials. They created 5 subjects using your baseline protocols: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Epsilon. 2 died in captivity from complications. 2 weeks ago, I couldn't watch anymore. Helped Atlas escape, planned to free the others. Cross retaliated by taking Emma. I was supposed to bring you both back. Instead, I'm burning my life down. He pulled a folded photograph from his vest, edges worn from constant handling. A girl with Marcus's dark eyes and a smile that suggested she believed the world still held more wonder than cruelty. She's everything I have left, Kate. After her mother died, Emma became my reason for staying alive through every horrific thing Genesis called progress. Kate took the photo with numb fingers, studying the child's face and seeing a reflection of every choice that had led to this clearing. She'd designed the genetic architecture that made subjects like Atlas possible. Marcus had enabled escape that triggered Emma's kidnapping. Both carried culpability for different pieces of the same nightmare. Atlas touched Kate's hand where it held Emma's photograph, then placed the same hand over its own chest, a gesture of connection, of shared stakes. The creature was linking Emma's fate to its family's imprisonment, making clear that rescue wouldn't be exclusive or conditional. Everyone trapped in Genesis facilities deserved freedom, regardless of species or whose child they happened to be. Kate looked between Marcus and Atlas, seeing different expressions of the same desperation. The only man who'd helped her escape corporate slavery and the being her research had sentenced to existence as laboratory property. Both asking if she'd run again or finally stop running long enough to fight. She folded the photograph and tucked it inside her jacket pocket, next to her heart. Then we saved them all. Marcus exhaled something between relief and disbelief. Kate, Genesis has a full tactical division guarding those facilities. We're talking military-grade security, thermal imaging, response teams. I don't care. The words emerged colder than she'd intended, carrying 3 years of suppressed rage alongside morning frost. I built the cage. I'm tearing it down. Atlas struggled to its feet, movement stiff but determined. Blood still seeped from rope wounds, but the creature stood regardless, shoulders squared despite visible tremors. It pointed north with one massive hand, then tapped its own chest before gesturing toward Emma's photograph. Marcus translated the obvious. It can sense them, the other subjects, some kind of biological homing instinct Genesis engineered into the neural pathways. Kate's scientist mind caught the implications immediately. If Atlas could track its family's location, they wouldn't need Genesis facility maps or insider intelligence. The creature was a living compass pointed toward the very people they needed to rescue. Cross had designed subjects to find each other, probably assuming recovered specimens would lead hunters back to escaped assets. She studied the being's face, seeing past genetic markers and experimental designations to the person underneath. Atlas wasn't a weapon or research specimen. It was someone's family, fighting to reclaim loved ones stolen by people who viewed consciousness as intellectual property. Sounds reached them through the trees before any of them could move. Multiple boot steps, coordinated spacing, tactical approach patterns that sent ice down Kate's spine. Marcus's expression shifted into combat readiness, hand dropping to the sidearm holstered at his hip. 3 figures emerged from different vectors, triangulating the clearing with professional precision. Black tactical gear, no visible insignia, weapons raised but not yet aimed. The leader wore mirrored sunglasses despite forest shadow, voice emerging flat and mechanical through communication gear. Dr. Morrison, Marcus Webb, step away from Subject Alpha. The speaker's face registered in Kate's memory with sickening recognition. Hawk, Genesis security chief, Cross's personal enforcer, the man who'd escorted her from the building after her resignation and warned that people who stole company property usually ended up regretting it in ways their families felt for generations. He moved closer, weapon trained on Atlas, with practiced steadiness. Dr. Cross sends his regards. Also a reminder that Marcus has 68 hours remaining on the Emma deadline. Marcus went rigid beside her. Where is she? Comfortable, fed, unharmed. Hawk's tone suggested he was reading from a shopping list. Provided you both come voluntarily and Subject Alpha returns to containment without incident. Kate positioned herself between Hawk's weapon and Atlas, hands empty but stance rigid with refusal. Not happening. Dr. Morrison, you don't understand the situation. I understand Cross has a 12-year-old hostage and thinks that gives him leverage over people who've already lost everything. Her voice carried across the clearing with surgical precision. I understand he's threatening a child to reclaim escaped prisoners. What I don't understand is how any of you follow orders from a man who measures success by how many sentient beings you torture. Hawk's expression remained neutral behind mirrored lenses. Sentient is a matter of legal definition. Genesis Legal Counsel has determined subjects qualify as corporate assets under current intellectual property law. Emma's not corporate property. Emma is leverage. Hawk raised his comm unit, finger hovering over the call button. If Dr. Morrison and Subject Alpha don't accompany us immediately, the girl gets transferred to Lab Omega. Once she's inside that facility, Webb, you know what happens to witnesses Cross considers inconvenient. The radio crackled before Marcus could respond, background sounds bleeding through whatever channel Hawk had opened. A child's scream, high and terrified, cut off abruptly by adult voices issuing commands. Then something else. Something that shouldn't have been possible through the distortion. A roar. Deep, resonant, unmistakably non-human. The kind of vocalization that came from a chest cavity twice the size of any human lung capacity. Atlas went rigid beside Kate, entire body tensing as recognition crashed through whatever neural pathways connected it to family. The creature's throat produced an answering call, lower-pitched but harmonizing with the radio transmission in ways that suggested communication beyond simple noise. Kate's hands clenched into fists as understanding assembled itself. Emma's not just imprisoned somewhere. She's being held in the same facility as the other subjects. Hawk's silence confirmed what his words wouldn't. Cross had placed his human hostage in direct proximity to the cryptid family he was using as leverage against their escaped member. Everyone trapped inside Genesis walls represented bait for someone else, chains linking species through shared captivity. Marcus's voice dropped into a register Kate had never heard from him, cold enough to freeze blood. If Cross hurts my daughter, then you should have brought us what we asked for 72 hours ago. Hawk lowered the radio, professional mask slipping enough to show calculation underneath. Dr. Morrison comes willingly. Subject Alpha surrenders peacefully. Everyone goes home. That's the only scenario where Emma Webb celebrates her 13th birthday. Kate felt Atlas tense beside her, muscles coiling for violence that would solve nothing except painting this clearing in blood that wouldn't bring anyone closer to rescue. She placed one hand on the creature's massive forearm, feeling corded strength barely restrained. No. The word emerged steady, carrying 3 years of running finally crystallized into standing ground. We're not trading ourselves for promises from a man who traffics in genetic slavery. Emma deserves better. So does Atlas's family. Hawk's hand moved toward his weapon. Marcus's hand moved faster, sidearm clearing holster with practiced efficiency that spoke to thousands of hours training under the same man now threatening everything he'd built his life around protecting. The standoff crystallized into impossible mathematics. 3 tactical operatives against 1 exhausted creature, 1 scientist carrying only a knife, and 1 security professional torn between mission parameters and moral lines drawn in frozen earth. Numbers favored Genesis until Kate factored in the variable that changed every calculation. Atlas hadn't tried to escape. Despite freedom from restraints and clear opportunity to vanish into mountain wilderness, the creature stood beside her and Marcus, choosing solidarity over survival. Whatever Genesis had done to its family, Atlas valued those bonds more than personal safety. That kind of loyalty deserved reciprocation. Kate pulled her knife again, not threatening Hawk, but making her position unmistakable. You tell Cross we're coming for them, all of them, and when we're done, there won't be enough left of his operation to sell for scrap." Hawk actually smiled behind his tactical gear. "Dr. Morrison, you designed the cage. You know how thoroughly engineered it is. Even if you reach Lab Omega, you'll never get inside. And if by some miracle you breach containment, Cross has fail-safes you can't imagine. Then I'll imagine harder." She gestured toward Atlas. "This being just survived days restrained in sub-freezing temperatures. Its family has endured months in captivity. Emma's spent 3 days terrified in ways no child should experience. They've all survived your fail-safe so far. Maybe the weakness isn't in the prisoners." Something shifted in the air between them, tension ratcheting toward violence that would leave permanent marks on whoever survived it. Kate measured distances, angles, probability that she could close with Hawk before his team responded. Marcus was already moving, subtle weight shifts that suggested he was calculating the same geometry from professional experience. Atlas made the decision for all of them. The creature surged forward with speed that contradicted its injuries, not attacking, but positioning massive bulk between Kate and the tactical team. One enormous hand swept out, catching Hawk's weapon and wrenching it upward as the operative's finger tightened on the trigger. Shots cracked through mountain air, shredding pine branches overhead and sending birds Kate hadn't realized were present exploding from cover in panicked clouds. Marcus fired twice, precise shots that took down Hawk's support team with center mass hits to tactical vests. Not lethal, but disabling, buying seconds that stretched into opportunity. Kate grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him backward toward denser forest, while Atlas held ground against Hawk's attempts to recover his weapon. They ran. Branches tore at exposed skin, roots threatened to trip every step, and behind them Hawk's voice carried through comm units already summoning reinforcement. But ahead lay wilderness. Kate had spent 3 years learning to navigate blindfolded, advantages Genesis training couldn't match. Atlas caught up within 50 yards, moving with surprising silence for something its size. The creature took point without discussion, navigating terrain by senses Kate couldn't match. Marcus covered their rear, weapon raised and tracking for pursuit that would come regardless of how far they ran. They didn't stop until a half-mile separated them from the clearing, lungs burning and legs trembling from exertion that left them gasping against frozen tree trunks. Kate's pack had vanished somewhere during the flight, taking supplies she'd need for extended wilderness survival. Marcus still carried his tactical vest, but ammunition wouldn't last against determined pursuit. Atlas crouched beside them, breath steaming in great clouds that suggested exertion, but not exhaustion. The creature produced a small sound, somewhere between inquiry and reassurance, checking if its companions could continue. Marcus met Kate's eyes, face carrying the kind of weariness that came from crossing lines no training prepared anyone to navigate. What now? Now we become what Genesis made us. Kate straightened despite protesting muscles, mind already assembling pieces into strategy. They took Emma because they think she's leverage. They kept your family because they think you're assets. Everyone's wrong. She turned to Atlas, reading intelligence and features Genesis would classify as primitive. "Can you still feel them? Your family?" Atlas nodded slowly, raising one hand to point north-northeast. The same direction Genesis had always maintained its secure research facilities, far from population centers where accidents might attract unwanted attention. "How far?" The creature studied the horizon, then held both hands apart in a gesture suggesting significant but traversable distance. Maybe 15 miles, perhaps 20. Close enough that Atlas had probably heard its family's cries from this clearing when wind carried sound properly. Kate's throat tightened around implications. Atlas had been restrained within audible range of imprisoned loved ones, forced to listen while unable to help. Genesis' cruelty ran deeper than simple containment. Cross had designed psychological torture into the architectural layout. Marcus checked his weapon, counting remaining ammunition with practiced efficiency. Genesis will have full tactical teams guarding the facility. Thermal imaging, motion sensors, response protocols designed to contain exactly this kind of breach attempt. We're outgunned, outmanned, and running on rage instead of planning. Then rage will have to be enough. Kate pulled Emma's photograph from her jacket, studying the girl's smile until details burned themselves into permanent memory. Cross thinks we'll trade ourselves for hostages. Instead, we're going to take everything he values and burn the rest. Atlas touched the photograph with surprising gentleness, one massive finger tracing Emma's smile with care that suggested the creature already felt protective of the child it had never met. When it looked up, Kate saw something beyond intelligence or even understanding. She saw a recognition of shared purpose. They were family now, not through genetics or species classification, but through the bonds forged when people chose to stand against overwhelming force because surrender meant abandoning everyone who couldn't defend themselves. Marcus holstered his weapon with decisive finality. Then we do it smart, hit them when they were not expecting us, target their weaknesses, get Emma and the subjects out before Cross can implement whatever fail-safes he's threatening. Speaking from experience, Marcus, Cross doesn't make empty threats. Kate's voice carried 3 years of intimate knowledge about Genesis CEO psychology. If he says he has fail-safes, he means scorched earth protocols, self-destruct mechanisms, evidence elimination, witness disposal. The moment he realizes we're coming, everyone inside those walls becomes expendable. So we don't give him time to realize. Kate nodded slowly, pieces falling into place with mechanical precision. We move fast, hit hard, and pray Atlas's homing instinct gets us to the right facility before Genesis locks down every entrance. Atlas grunted affirmation, already rising and moving north with purpose that suggested it had been waiting for permission to hunt. The creature's entire demeanor shifted from injured prisoner to focused predator, trailing family scent through wilderness with single-minded determination. They followed, Kate and Marcus falling into rhythm beside each other that spoke to old training and older trust. Neither mentioned that this mission would probably end with all three of them dead or recaptured. Some truths didn't require acknowledgement. The sun tracked slowly across afternoon sky as they climbed higher into mountains that held Genesis secrets in frozen earth and stone. Behind them, Hawk's reinforcements would be coordinating pursuit with resources Kate couldn't match. Ahead, Emma waited in captivity alongside beings whose existence testified to humanity's capacity for cruelty, dressed in progress. Kate's thoughts drifted to classified files still encrypted on backup drives hidden in her abandoned cabin. Evidence that could destroy Genesis if it ever reached public attention. Testimony about genetic experiments conducted without consent or oversight, subjects created specifically to suffer and die in service of corporate profit margins. She'd stolen that data 3 years ago, planning to release it when timing felt safe. Now she realized safety was a luxury hostages couldn't afford. Emma didn't have time for Kate to wait for perfect circumstances. Atlas's family couldn't endure additional months while she assembled ironclad legal cases. Sometimes the right thing required abandoning perfect plans in favor of imperfect action. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley as sunset painted mountains in shades of blood and gold. Atlas stopped suddenly, entire body going rigid with tension that suggested prey finally sighting the predator's den. Kate followed the creature's gaze and felt her stomach drop. Genesis had built a fortress in the valley below, not the sterile glass and steel corporate campus she remembered from her employment, but a military-grade compound that wouldn't look out of place in classified overseas operations. Guard towers, thermal imaging arrays, prefabricated structures arranged in defensive perimeter around a central facility built partially underground. Helicopter pad, vehicle depot, enough infrastructure to support 50 personnel minimum. Marcus whistled softly between his teeth. That's not a research lab, that's a black site. Lab Omega, Kate's voice emerged hollow. Cross's private facility, the place he moves projects when they're too controversial for main campus oversight. She'd heard rumors about Lab Omega during her Genesis tenure, whispered conversations in break rooms about where discontinued experiments ended up. Most staff assumed the name referred to metaphorical termination. Looking at the Valley compound, Kate realized Cross had been more literal. Omega represented the endpoint, the place where Genesis work concluded one way or another. Atlas made a sound low in its throat, somewhere between mourning and fury. The creature could probably sense its family somewhere inside that fortress, close enough to reach but protected by layers of security designed specifically to contain beings with Atlas's capabilities. Kate studied the compound's layout, cataloging defenses with the same analytical precision she'd once applied to genetic sequencing. Every security measure represented a weakness if approached from unexpected angles. Guard rotation created temporal gaps. Thermal imaging couldn't penetrate properly insulated barriers. Even the most sophisticated response protocols assumed threats would follow predictable patterns. Genesis had designed Lab Omega to contain specimens trying to escape from inside. They probably hadn't planned for rescue attempts from outside by people who understood their security architecture intimately. Marcus crouched beside her, following her gaze across defensive positions. "We're going in tonight." Not a question. Statement of fact from a man who'd already sacrificed career and safety for principles that demanded immediate action, regardless of cost. Kate nodded slowly. "We go in tonight. We get Emma and Atlas's family out, and then we make sure Cross can never do this to anyone else." Atlas placed one massive hand on each of their shoulders, grip gentle despite strength that could crush bone. The gesture carried meaning beyond language. Gratitude, solidarity, promise that it wouldn't abandon them regardless of what horrors waited inside Genesis walls. They had perhaps 4 hours until full darkness. 4 hours to plan an assault against fortified position with minimal weapons, no backup, and every statistical indicator suggesting failure. 4 hours before they walked into the same nightmare they were trying to end. Kate met Marcus's eyes and saw her own resignation reflected there. This wasn't the smart play, wasn't the cautious approach that maximized survival odds. But Emma deserved parents willing to risk impossible odds, and Atlas's family deserved allies who wouldn't abandon them to corporate machinery that reduced consciousness to inventory. Sometimes heroism and stupidity occupied the same space, distinguished only by outcome and who survived to write the history. The sun touched distant peaks, flooding the valley in light that made Genesis compound look almost beautiful. Security lights began activating as darkness approached, illuminating perimeter with harsh white glow that would make infiltration exponentially harder. Kate shouldered the rifle Marcus silently offered, checking the safety with hands that had once held pipettes and now held weapons. 3 years of hiding had taught her wilderness survival. Tonight would teach her whether running away or standing ground marked the person she'd become. Atlas moved toward the valley's edge, ready to descend the moment darkness fell. Marcus checked his remaining ammunition, face set in lines that suggested he'd already made peace with whatever came next. Kate whispered to the mountains, to Emma trapped somewhere in the compound below, to every being Genesis had reduced to experimental subject and inventory line. "We're coming, hold on just a little longer." The words vanished into wind that carried them down into the valley where lights blazed against gathering night, and somewhere inside concrete walls, people waited for rescue. They had no reason to believe would ever arrive. Darkness fell like a shroud across the valley, transforming Genesis compound into an island of harsh light against mountain shadow. Kate descended the ridge with Marcus and Atlas, each footfall calculated to avoid loose stones that might cascade and announce their approach. The creature moved with impossible silence for something its size, teaching them through example how to flow around obstacles rather than through them. The perimeter fence hummed with current strong enough to stop a charging bear. Kate studied the power signature, recognizing commercial-grade electrification that would leave anyone touching it convulsing on frozen ground. But Genesis engineers had made the mistake of trusting technology over redundancy. The system ran on single-source power, vulnerable to anyone who understood its architecture. Marcus produced wire cutters from his tactical vest, then paused as Kate touched his arm. She gestured toward a junction box mounted on the nearest fence post, barely visible in shadow between security lights. Her fingers worked the access panel, bypassing locks she'd seen installed during her Genesis tenure when security upgrades had required research staff input on facility layout. The panel opened to reveal circuitry that hadn't changed in 3 years. Kate traced power flow with eyes that had once mapped genetic sequences and now mapped electrical pathways leading toward the same goal. She pulled 2 specific wires, crossed them, and watched perimeter lights flicker once before stabilizing. The fence current died in a 10-meter radius, invisible failure that monitoring stations wouldn't register for another 30 seconds before automated diagnostics flagged the anomaly. Marcus cut through chain link in that window, peeling back metal to create an opening just large enough for Atlas to squeeze through with inches to spare. They crossed into compound territory, as security lights continued their patrol patterns, oblivious to the breach occurring in spaces their sensors no longer monitored. Kate led them toward the central structure, the underground entrance she'd seen from the ridge. Her Genesis keycard still hung from a chain around her neck, kept more from inability to discard the past than any expectation it might have functioned after 3 years. The entrance loomed ahead, reinforced door set into concrete that descended deep beneath mountain stone. Atlas stopped suddenly, entire body tensing as if physically struck. The creature's hand rose to press against its chest, then pointed at the door with urgency that transcended language. They were close. Close enough that Atlas could feel family presence through whatever biological mechanism Genesis had engineered into cryptid neurology. The beings it had been separated from waited somewhere beyond that door, contained but alive. Kate approached the access panel, holding her breath as she swiped the keycard through its reader. The light flashed red once, twice, then cycled to green as locks disengaged with mechanical precision. Marcus stared. "How did that?" "Cross kept my credentials active." Kate's voice emerged hollow with realization. "He's been waiting for me to come back." The implications crystallized with sickening clarity. Every day since her escape, Cross had maintained her security access, knowing that eventually desperation or guilt would drive her toward Genesis facilities. He'd left the door open, baiting a trap with her own need to undo damage she'd helped create. She met Marcus's eyes, seeing understanding reflected there. They were walking into calculated ambush, proceeding anyway because turning back meant abandoning everyone trapped inside walls Cross had specifically designed to exploit their weaknesses. The elevator descended 200 feet through mountain stone, dropping them into depths where screaming wouldn't carry and witnesses wouldn't stumble across activities conducted in the name of scientific progress. Fluorescent lights flickered to life as doors opened, revealing corridors so sterile they could have been transplanted from her memories of working late nights when only ambition and naivety kept her pushing genetic boundaries. Atlas moved forward with predator focus, trailing scent or sensation Kate couldn't perceive. They followed through passages that branched and reconnected in maze patterns that would have confused anyone lacking the creature's homing instinct. Marcus covered their rear, weapon raised, tracking for security personnel who should have intercepted them by now. The absence of resistance felt more threatening than opposition. Genesis didn't leave high-value facilities unguarded unless guards weren't necessary, unless the facility itself functioned as containment for anyone foolish enough to enter. Kate's unease crystallized into certainty when they reached a windowed observation room. She approached the glass and felt her heart stop. Emma sat in a chair bolted to the floor, electrodes attached to her temples with medical precision. The girl's face carried tear tracks, but her eyes remained open, focused on a screen positioned directly in her line of sight. Dark hair hung tangled around thin shoulders, and bruises mottled her wrists where restraints had held her for however long Cross had been conducting his experiments. Marcus's breath caught, sound somewhere between sob and growl. He moved toward the door, but Kate grabbed his arm, pointing at the sign mounted above the entrance. Observation Room 3, Empathy Response Testing. A scientist Kate didn't recognize sat at a control panel, monitoring readouts that spiked and fell in rhythm with whatever imagery Emma was being forced to endure. The woman's voice carried through speakers with clinical detachment. "Subject web, Emma. Tell us what you're feeling as you watch the screen." The display facing Emma flickered to show another room, this one containing a massive creature held down by restraints, while technicians drew blood from wounds that wept despite obvious attempts at medical intervention. The being was clearly elderly, fur grayed and body bent with age, but conscious and aware enough to struggle weakly against bonds. Emma's voice emerged small and broken. "Stop, please stop, you're hurting her." "Interesting." The scientist made notes on her tablet. "Empathy response registers at 87%. Subject identifies with non-human entity despite species difference." Kate's scientific training provided context her conscience wished it couldn't. Genesis was testing whether humans could form emotional bonds with cryptid subjects, quantifying attachment in ways that would inform whatever protocols Cross intended to implement. If human empathy extended across species boundaries, then cryptid hostages could control human behavior through manufactured emotional leverage. Marcus's face had gone pale, understanding arriving with the kind of horror that came from recognizing your daughter had been reduced to experimental data point. His hand tightened on his weapon, and Kate knew he was calculating whether he could shoot through the observation glass before security protocols activated. Atlas pressed against the window, massive hands splayed across glass as it stared at the elderly cryptid displayed on Emma's screen. The creature's chest produced a low sound, barely audible, carrying more grief than rage. Kate touched Atlas's shoulder. "Your mother?" The nod that followed contained entire histories of loss. Epsilon, the matriarch, the being Genesis had captured first, using her to lure family members into traps baited with maternal instinct. And now Cross was torturing her within Emma's sight, forcing a child to witness suffering while measuring her psychological responses for future reference. Marcus moved toward the door with purpose that suggested consequences would follow, regardless of tactical wisdom. Kate followed, knowing they'd passed the point where careful planning mattered more than immediate action. Atlas brought up the rear, moving with controlled violence that would erupt the moment barrier separating them from Emma disappeared. Kate's keycard opened the observation room's lock. The scientist looked up from her tablet, recognition dawning too late to trigger whatever alarm protocols would have summoned security. Marcus crossed the space in 3 strides, weapon pressed against the woman's temple with pressure that suggested he was measuring whether killing her would improve or complicate their situation. "Disable the restraints! Now!" The scientist's hands shook as she entered commands. Emma's electrodes disengaged, chair restraints releasing with pneumatic hisses. The girl stood on trembling legs, turning to see her father for the first time in 3 days. "Dad?" Marcus caught her as she stumbled, wrapping arms around thin shoulders that shook with sobs Emma had been holding back through however many hours of psychological torture Genesis had inflicted. His voice cracked when he managed speech. "I've got you, honey. You're safe now." Emma pulled back enough to see Atlas standing in the doorway, 8 feet of predator physiology that should have sent her screaming. Instead, her expression shifted through fear towards something approaching recognition. "You're Epsilon's family." Atlas inclined its head slowly, studying the child with intensity that suggested it was assessing whether she'd been permanently damaged by captivity. When Emma extended one small hand toward the creature's massive one, Atlas accepted the gesture with surprising gentleness. "She saved me." Emma's voice steadied as she addressed Kate directly. "The guards were mean when Dad's messages stopped coming. Epsilon got between us. She protected me even though they hurt her for it." Kate's throat closed around words that wouldn't form. Cross had imprisoned Emma alongside the cryptid matriarch, forcing proximity that created the emotional bonds his empathy testing was designed to measure. Epsilon had responded with maternal instinct that transcended species classification, choosing to shield a human child from cruelty Genesis personnel inflicted. And Genesis had quantified that compassion, reducing it to data points in empathy percentages while planning future experiments that would exploit the same protective instincts. Marcus kept one arm around Emma while addressing the scientist Marcus still held at gunpoint. "Where are the other subjects?" The woman's eyes flicked toward a facility map displayed on her tablet. "Sublevel 3, containment cells. But you can't, we already are." Kate took the tablet, studying the layout that matched her worst expectations. Genesis had built Lab Omega as a vertical facility, descending through multiple sublevels with progressively more secure containment. The deepest level held what the map labeled as high-value assets and cells designed to contain beings with Atlas's capabilities. Atlas growled softly, recognizing something on the map Kate couldn't identify. The creature pointed at 3 separate cell markers with increasing urgency, communicating that its family remained separated even in captivity. Cross hadn't just imprisoned them, he'd isolated them from each other, preventing contact that might strengthen resolve or coordinate resistance. They moved deeper into the facility, following Atlas through corridors that grew progressively more institutional. Research labs gave way to medical bays, then to something that looked disturbingly similar to veterinary facilities designed for large animals. The air carried scents Kate recognized from her time conducting genetic research on tissue samples: disinfectant, preserved specimens, the particular chemical signature of cryogenic storage. A door marked "Archives, Authorized Personnel Only" caught her attention as they passed. Her keycard opened it without resistance, revealing rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals that hummed with active data storage. Kate hesitated, torn between immediate rescue mission and opportunity to document evidence that might prevent Genesis from simply rebuilding whatever they destroyed tonight. Marcus saw her expression and understood. 30 seconds. Then we keep moving. Kate accessed the nearest terminal, fingers flying across keys as she navigated through directory structures she'd helped design. Project Genesis files opened at her touch, revealing documentation that made her previous understanding of Genesis activities seem naive. Phase 1, Cryptid acquisition. Complete. Field teams had captured Atlas's family 18 months ago, using Epsilon as bait to lure younger members into restraints. Medical records detailed injuries sustained during initial containment, including injuries that had permanently crippled one subject's hand. Phase 2, genetic extraction and human integration, complete. Tissue samples harvested from cryptid subjects had been used to create 5 hybrid entities, each exhibiting different trait expressions. Subject 0, Kate herself, showed highest integration success. Subjects Alpha through Epsilon demonstrated varying degrees of stability. Phase 3, mass replication and military application, 73% complete. Genesis had sold preliminary data to Department of Defense contractors, promising delivery of 1,000 hybrid soldiers within 6 months. Production facility construction was scheduled to begin next quarter. Phase 4, civilian applications. The final stage chilled Kate's blood more than military contracts. Genesis planned to offer gene therapy to wealthy clients, marketing cryptid DNA integration as life extension treatment. Initial client list included senators, corporate executives, and foreign dignitaries willing to pay millions for unauthorized human experimentation. Kate's hands shook as she scrolled through names she recognized from news coverage and political briefings. People who shaped policy and controlled resources, all eager to purchase advantages genetics could provide, regardless of ethical cost. Cross had built an empire not just on military contracts, but on vanity and fear of mortality, selling evolution to anyone wealthy enough to afford it. A subfolder caught her attention, labeled with her own name. Kate opened it against instincts, screaming that some knowledge carried costs beyond bearing. Subject 0, Morrison Protocol. Her medical file from 5 years ago, before Genesis had hired her as research geneticist. Cancer diagnosis. Stage 3. Prognosis, 18 months without aggressive intervention. Recommended treatment. Experimental gene therapy combining targeted viral vectors with regenerative cellular stimulation. She'd believed every word when Cross had presented the opportunity. Believed she was receiving cutting-edge medical treatment that would save her life while contributing to legitimate research. The consent forms had been thorough, the medical team professional, and her desperation to survive had overridden questions about exactly what cellular sources were being integrated into her DNA. Cryptid DNA. Cross had injected her with genetic material harvested from beings whose existence she hadn't even believed in, transforming her into something neither fully human nor purely other. The neural enhancements that had made her brilliant enough to design Subject Alpha's genetic architecture? Side effects of cryptid integration? Her ability to survive 3 years alone in the mountain wilderness? Regeneration genes expressing themselves in ways medical science couldn't predict. Kate had spent years believing she'd escape Genesis with her integrity intact. Instead, she'd been carrying their greatest achievement inside every cell, walking proof that human cryptid hybridization could work if introduced through mechanisms the host body didn't recognize as invasion. An attached document made her vision blur. Replication attempts, 23 failures. Cross had tried to recreate her success 24 times, injecting other terminal patients with similar protocols. None had survived integration, their bodies rejecting foreign DNA and cascading immune responses that resulted in death within weeks. Kate wasn't just a former employee Cross wanted recaptured. She was the only successful template, the living blueprint he needed to perfect mass hybridization protocols. Without her, Phase 4 remained theoretical. With her, Genesis could create thousands of people desperate enough to accept cryptid genes if it meant escaping mortality. Marcus's hand on her shoulder jolted her back to present awareness. Kate, we need to move. She closed the files, but not before initiating a background upload protocol that would copy everything to remote servers. The data transfer would take hours, running silently while Genesis remained unaware their secrets were bleeding into networks Cross couldn't control. Even if Kate died in this facility, evidence would survive to testify against everyone involved. They descended another level, entering spaces that felt less like research facility and more like prison. Containment cells lined both sides of the corridor, each fronted with reinforced glass that would stop anything short of military ordnance. And behind that glass, Atlas's family waited in isolation that Cross had designed to break spirit before killing body. Beta occupied the first cell, female and visibly pregnant despite captivity that should have prevented successful gestation. Her furs showed bald patches where tissue samples had been repeatedly harvested, and her eyes carried the kind of weariness that came from enduring pain without hope of relief. But when Atlas approached the glass, Beta's expression transformed into something that transcended species, a parent seeing their child alive when all evidence suggested orphaning. The second cell held Gamma, male and bearing scars that spoke to violent resistance against containment. His left hand ended in a stump wrapped in medical gauze, obviously amputated during captivity for reasons Kate could guess. Genesis would have wanted to study regeneration limits, testing whether cryptids could regrow lost limbs or if tissue damage remained permanent. Gamma had paid for that curiosity with permanent disability. Delta pressed against the glass of the third cell, younger than Atlas by several years and clearly terrified by months of imprisonment. The juvenile cryptid's fur remained thick and undamaged, suggesting Cross had been saving Delta for experiments that required pristine samples. Fear shone in eyes that tracked every movement, expecting pain from any source. Kate's keycard opened each cell in sequence, watching as Atlas's family stumbled into the corridor on legs that shook from disuse and malnutrition. Beta moved immediately to Atlas, pressing their foreheads together in a gesture that conveyed reunion words couldn't capture. Gamma stood beside them, one-handed but unbowed, shoulders squared despite everything Genesis had taken. Delta clung to Atlas's side, seeking protection from beings who represented family in ways captivity had tried but failed to erase. Emma watched the reunion with eyes still carrying electrode burn marks, understanding something fundamental about the beings Cross had classified as research assets. They love each other, just like people do. Marcus's arm tightened around his daughter's shoulders, and Kate saw him processing implications he tried to avoid during his Genesis tenure. These weren't animals to be studied. They were people, complete with family bonds and emotional complexity that made their suffering and Cross's cruelty equally unconscionable. Atlas gestured urgently, pointing back toward the level they'd descended from. Emma translated the obvious. Epsilon, she's still up there. They reversed course, following Atlas back to the medical bay where observation room screens had shown the matriarch being drained of blood and tissue. Kate's keycard opened door after door, each barrier falling away until they stood before the cell, holding Genesis's oldest captive. Epsilon lay on a medical table, IV lines running from both arms into collection bags that hung nearly full with blood dark enough to seem black under fluorescent lights. Age marked every inch of visible anatomy, fur gone silver, skin crepe paper thin, breathing shallow enough to suggest hours rather than days remaining. But consciousness persisted in eyes that tracked their entrance with awareness that hadn't diminished despite everything Genesis had extracted. Beta made a sound Kate had never heard before, anguish given voice in ways that transcended language barriers. The younger cryptid moved to the matriarch's side, massive hands trembling as they touched Epsilon's face with gentleness that belied their size. Atlas removed IV lines with surprising dexterity, stemming blood flow from puncture wounds that should have clotted but remained weeping. Epsilon's regeneration genes were failing, body finally succumbing to months of systematic harvesting that had drained life faster than healing could compensate. The matriarch's hand rose slowly, shaking with effort, forming shapes Kate suddenly recognized. Sign language. Epsilon had learned to communicate using methods Genesis staff probably taught during early captivity, before Cross had decided verbal communication made subjects too obviously sentient. Her fingers spelled words with painful deliberation. Emma, brave, girl. Marcus's breath hitched. The cryptid matriarch had protected his daughter, and now with death approaching, Epsilon was reassuring him that Emma possessed strength to survive trauma Genesis had inflicted. Epsilon's gaze shifted to Atlas, hands forming more signs. Find, beta, delta, gamma, lead, family. Kate understood with crystalline clarity. The matriarch was passing authority to Atlas, naming the younger cryptid as new family leader. Epsilon wouldn't survive extraction from Genesis custody. Her body had given everything possible, buying time for family members through her own systematic destruction. Now she was ensuring Atlas understood the weight of responsibility being transferred along with freedom. Atlas touched its mother's hand, massive fingers completely engulfing Epsilon's as understanding passed between them. The younger cryptid had led escape attempts before. Now it would lead permanently, carrying wisdom Epsilon had spent a lifetime gathering. Alarms shattered the moment, klaxons echoing through corridors with volume designed to be heard throughout the entire facility. Red emergency lights replaced fluorescence, painting everything in shades that had suggested blood and warning. Automated voice began counting down from 60 seconds, announcing containment breach and initiating lockdown protocols. Atlas tensed, pulling family close as doors throughout the facility began sealing with hydraulic finality. Kate spun toward the nearest exit, already knowing it would be too late. Cross had been waiting for exactly this scenario, and now his trap was springing with mechanical precision. Gas hissed from ventilation shafts, colorless and odorless, but obviously designed for purpose beyond climate control. Gamma collapsed within seconds, massive body hitting tile with impact that cracked flooring. Delta went next, then Beta despite pregnancy that should have offered some protection. Atlas staggered, fighting effects that were overwhelming its family, trying to stay conscious through whatever sedative Genesis had engineered specifically for cryptid physiology. Emma dropped in Marcus's arms, her smaller body volume meaning faster uptake of whatever compound filled the air. Marcus caught her, struggling to stay upright as his own vision began tunneling. Kate felt the edges of consciousness fraying, regeneration genes delaying, but not preventing the inevitable. The door opened and Dr. Vincent Cross entered, gas mask protecting him from the toxin he'd released into his own facility. He looked exactly as Kate remembered. Tall, silver-haired, wearing $3,000 suits even in underground laboratories. Behind him, Hawk and 4 operatives maintained perimeter security with weapons raised. Cross's voice carried through his mask with conversational pleasantness. Dr. Morrison, thank you for gathering everyone in one convenient location. You've saved my team's considerable effort. Kate's knees buckled, and she caught herself against Epsilon's medical table. The matriarch still breathed, barely, consciousness persisting through sedative that dropped beings twice her size. You knew we'd come. I designed the facility specifically to encourage it. Cross approached slowly, confident in chemicals doing work violence couldn't accomplish. You're predictable, Kate, always have been. Present you with suffering you believe you caused, and you'll sacrifice anything to alleviate guilt. Marcus tried to raise his weapon, but hands that had held steady through combat scenarios now trembled too much for accurate aim. Hawk stepped forward and retrieved the gun with professional efficiency, then stepped back to maintain tactical distance. Emma lay unconscious in her father's loosening grip, tear tracks still visible on her face. Cross glanced at the girl with clinical detachment. The child demonstrated excellent empathy response, scores in the 87th percentile, quite useful data for Phase 4 implementations. Marcus's voice emerged as growl despite sedative pulling him towards unconsciousness. She's your goddamn lab rat. She's a data point. Cross knelt beside Epsilon, studying the matriarch with the same expression he'd probably worn while dissecting specimens. As are all of you, even Dr. Morrison, though she represents considerably more valuable research opportunity. He produced a tablet, pulling up files Kate had just finished reading. Subject 0 documentation appeared on screen, complete with her medical history and failed replication attempts. 23 failures, Kate. 23 terminal patients who died because I couldn't recreate what your body accomplished. Do you understand how frustrating that's been? Knowing perfection exists but remaining unable to duplicate it? Kate's vision doubled, split, merged again with effort that left her gasping. You're not taking me alive. Oh, I don't need you alive. Not permanently. Cross gestured and Hawk produced medical equipment Kate recognized from her cancer treatment. Biopsy needles, tissue preservation containers, genetic sequencing apparatus. I just need your day intact. Consciousness is optional. Atlas made a desperate lunge toward Cross, but sedative had advanced too far. The creature collapsed mid-stride, hitting tile beside its family members. Only Epsilon remained partially conscious, witnessing surrender she'd spent months fighting to prevent. Kate reached toward her pocket where she'd kept the thumb drive containing backup files, evidence that could destroy Genesis if it ever reached proper authorities. Her fingers closed around the device, pulling it free with movements that felt like pushing through syrup. Cross saw the drive and smiled. The encrypted files you stole 3 years ago. I was wondering when you'd try to leverage them. He extended his hand, expecting surrender. Kate looked at the drum at Cross, at Emma unconscious on cold tile. Then she opened her mouth and swallowed the device whole. Cross's expression shifted through surprise into genuine anger. What have you done? Bought time? Kate forced words through throat that wanted only to stop trying. That drive contains hardware encryption. Stomach acid won't damage it, but you can't cut me open without destroying its contents. Regeneration genes will break down any circuitry you try to extract from damaged tissue. The logic crystallized with beautiful simplicity. Cross needed her alive and intact to retrieve evidence that could dismantle his empire. And the longer retrieval took, the more opportunity existed for that evidence to reach parties who'd use it against Genesis. Cross stared at her, and Kate saw something she'd never witnessed before. Uncertainty in his carefully controlled expression. He turned to Hawk. How long until it passes through her system? 24 hours? Maybe 36 given her metabolism. Cross's jaw tightened. Fine. Sedate her carefully. No damage. Monitor everything. He glanced at Marcus and Emma. Put them in observation rooms. Webb watches his daughter undergo empathy testing until Morrison cooperates. Atlas stirred weakly on the floor, trying one more time to rise despite sedative flooding its system. Epsilon watched her child struggle, then made a decision that would echo through everything that followed. The matriarch's chest began glowing with bioluminescent patterns Kate had never seen documented in any Genesis research. Faint at first, then intensifying until Epsilon's entire body pulsed with light that seemed to originate from cellular level rather than surface anatomy. Cross stepped back, confused and suddenly wary. What is she? Epsilon's body released a pulse of energy that detonated every electronic device in the medical bay. Lights died instantly, plunging them into darkness broken only by emergency exit signs. The tablet Cross held sparked and went dead. Hawk's communication equipment fizzled into silence. Even the ventilation system stopped, cutting off sedative gas that had been maintaining their incapacity. Kate's head cleared as fresh air cycled through, regeneration genes processing remaining toxin faster than normal human metabolism could manage. Around her, Atlas and its family began stirring as gas effects diminished without constant reinforcement. Cross's voice carried through darkness with edge of panic Kate had never imagined hearing from him. Backup systems! Lights! But nothing responded. Epsilon's final act had generated an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to destroy every circuit in range, creating window of opportunity her family might use to escape captivity Genesis had maintained for months. The matriarch's glowing faded bioluminescence dying as rapidly as it had ignited. Her breathing stopped, chest falling still, with finality that needed no medical confirmation. Epsilon had converted her remaining life energy into weapon that gave her family fighting chance she'd never possessed. Beta screamed grief that shattered something fundamental in Kate's understanding of consciousness. The sound carried intelligence and emotional depth that made Cross's classification of cryptids as assets seem like the obscenity it had always been. Atlas surged to its feet despite lingering sedative, roaring challenge that echoed through dead facility. Gamma rose beside it, one-handed but ready for violence that had been denied too long. Delta stayed near Beta, protecting its pregnant sibling while she grieved. Hawk's team activated night vision equipment, green glow painting their faces in shades that made them appear inhuman. Cross had planned for power failure, ensuring his personnel maintained tactical advantage even when facility systems died. But he hadn't planned for rage. Atlas hit the first operative with force that sent the man flying into concrete walls hard enough to crack both. Gamma took the second, one massive hand closing around tactical vest and lifting the operative off his feet before slamming him back to tile. Delta surprised everyone by tackling the third juvenile fury, translating into surprising effectiveness. Hawk and his remaining operative backed toward the door, weapons tracking but unable to fire without hitting Cross in crossfire chaos. The Genesis CEO had positioned himself poorly, standing between his security team and the subjects they were supposed to be containing. Marcus grabbed Emma, cradling his daughter while staying low to avoid becoming collateral damage. Kate pulled Epsilon's body off the medical table, unwilling to leave the matriarch behind after sacrificing herself to create this opportunity. The elderly cryptid weighed less than Kate expected, body depleted by months of systematic harvesting. Atlas appeared beside her, gently taking Epsilon from Kate's arms. Grief filled the younger cryptid's expression, but survival instinct overrode mourning. Atlas cradled its mother with impossible tenderness, then moved toward the exit with family following. Cross reached it for alarm panel on the wall, trying to manually trigger lockdown protocols that no longer functioned through dead electronics. Kate intercepted him, hand closing around his wrist with strength regeneration genes granted. "You wanted me back. Here I am." Their eyes met in darkness, barely broken by emergency lighting, and Kate saw her former mentor finally recognize she'd become something beyond his capacity to control or contain. He'd made her into a hybrid without consent, transforming terminal patient into genetic marvel. Now that Marvel was walking out of his facility carrying evidence that would destroy everything he'd built. She released him, stepping back as Atlas's family moved through the door into quarters beyond. Marcus followed with Emma, Hawk's remaining operatives too occupied with injured teammates to pursue effectively. Cross's voice followed them into darkness. "Morrison, you don't understand what you're destroying. Genesis represents humanity's evolution. We're building the future." Kate paused at the threshold, turning back toward the man who'd sentenced her to death while calling it salvation. "You're building atrocity, and I'm tearing it down." She triggered the manual control beside the door, the mechanical backup that didn't require electronics. Water began flooding from ceiling-mounted fire suppression systems, deluge that would fill the facility within minutes. Cross had engineered Lab Omega deep underground for security. Now those same depths would become drowning chamber as thousands of gallons found nowhere to go except down. Hawk saw what she'd done and grabbed Cross, pulling him toward the exit even as his CEO protested that critical research remained unsecured. Operatives abandoned injured teammates, survival instinct, overwhelming tactical protocols as water pressure increased exponentially. Kate ran. Through corridors filling ankle-deep already, up emergency stairwells where water cascaded like artificial waterfalls, following Atlas's massive form as the cryptid led them toward freedom through routes only homing instinct could navigate. Beta struggled with pregnancy weight, and Gamma helped support her while Delta cleared path ahead. Marcus carried Emma, muscles straining as he climbed stairs 3 at a time despite his daughter's weight. Kate stayed close, ready to take Emma if Marcus faltered, though he showed no sign of stopping until solid ground separated them from drowning tomb behind. Water chased them upward, hungry and relentless, flooding labs where Genesis had conducted research that would now dissolve into evidence prosecutors could never recover. Kate thought of Cross somewhere below, probably trying to save data while his facility collapsed around him, unable to accept that his empire was liquefying into nothing. They burst through ground-level exit into night air that tasted like freedom, despite cold that instantly numbed exposed skin. The valley sprawled before them, wilderness offering sanctuary Cross's technology couldn't reach. Behind them, Lab Omega's surface structure began collapsing inward as underground levels filled completely. Explosions echoed through mountain stone as electrical systems shorted beneath tons of water pressure, destroying whatever evidence remained of Genesis operations in brilliant flashes that lit the valley like premature dawn. Atlas set Epsilon's body down gently in frozen grass beyond facility perimeter, the matriarch's sacrifice complete. Beta knelt beside her mother, keening grief that made Emma stir in Marcus's arms. The girl woke slowly, disoriented and frightened, but her father's presence seemed to ground her enough that panic didn't overwhelm consciousness. Kate collapsed beside Epsilon, pressing fingers against the matriarch's neck in futile search for pulse she knew wouldn't exist. The elderly cryptid had converted her entire remaining life force into electromagnetic pulse, biological weapon that Genesis research had never predicted or prepared to contain. Emma climbed down from Marcus's arms, moving with care toward Atlas's family despite having every reason to fear beings larger and stronger than any human. She knelt beside Epsilon, placing small hand on the matriarch's cooling shoulder. "Thank you for protecting me." Beta looked at the child, understanding, passing between human and cryptid, that Cross's empathy testing had measured, but never truly comprehended. Emma wasn't expressing learned response or strategic emotional manipulation. She genuinely grieved for being who'd chosen to shield her from cruelty Genesis personnel had inflicted. Atlas drew Emma gently away from Epsilon's body, then covered the matriarch with its own jacket, impromptu burial shroud that honored sacrifice words couldn't capture. Gamma and Delta stood beside their sibling, heads bowed in mourning ritual Kate suspected had roots older than human civilization. Sound of helicopter rotors cut through night air, growing louder as aircraft approached from the south. Kate scrambled to her feet, expecting Genesis reinforcements despite facility destruction. But the helicopter bore different markings, military insignia suggesting Department of Defense rather than corporate security. The aircraft descended toward them with spotlight painting their group in harsh white illumination that made Cryptid's eyes reflect like animals caught in headlights. Loudspeaker crackled to life with amplified voice that carried across the valley. "Dr. Morrison, Marcus Webb, stand down. You're all under federal custody." Soldiers rappelled from the helicopter before it fully landed, surrounding them with weapons trained but not yet firing. Kate counted 20 personnel, more than enough to overwhelm even Atlas's family if they chose violence over cooperation. The officer who approached wore Colonel's insignia and expression, suggesting he'd seen enough horror during his career that Genesis operations wouldn't surprise him. His eyes moved across their group, 2 humans, 1 child, 4 cryptids, and 1 corpse that defied easy classification. "Dr. Morrison, I'm Colonel Hayes. We've been monitoring Genesis operations for 6 months. Your data upload triggered alerts across multiple government agencies." He gestured toward Lab Omega's collapsing structures. "What happened here?" Kate met his eyes, too exhausted for anything except brutal honesty. "Justice. Finally." Hayes's soldiers maintained defensive perimeter while medics attended Emma's electrode burns and checked Marcus for injuries sustained during the facility breach. Kate stood apart, watching Atlas's family mourn Epsilon under spotlights that transformed their grief into something resembling theater. The military presence felt invasive in ways combat hadn't, turning private loss into documented incident, complete with photographers recording evidence for tribunals that might never convene. Emma pulled away from the medic treating her temples, moving back toward Beta despite her father's protests. The pregnant cryptid watched the child approach with wariness that dissolved when Emma placed small hands on Beta's rounded belly. "The baby's still okay. I can feel it moving." Beta's expression shifted into something Kate recognized despite species differences, maternal gratitude from one potential mother to another. The cryptid's massive hand covered Emma's gently, acknowledging connection that transcended the empathy testing Genesis had tried to quantify. Hayes approached Kate with tablet displaying data streams she'd initiated from Lab Omega's archives. "Your upload is causing significant disruption, Dr. Morrison. Genesis senior staff are being arrested as we speak. Senate oversight committees have launched emergency hearings. The Attorney General is assembling RICO charges." Kate studied the tablet, watching real-time news feeds showing federal agents raiding Genesis headquarters in 3 states simultaneously. Cross's carefully constructed empire was collapsing faster than Lab Omega had flooded, drowning in evidence she'd spent 3 years hoarding for exactly this purpose. "Where's Cross?" Hayes's expression carried the answer before words confirmed it. "Confirmed dead. His body was recovered from Lab Omega's lower levels. He tried to save research data instead of evacuating." The news should have brought satisfaction. Instead, Kate felt only hollow exhaustion. Cross's death meant he'd never face trial, never answer for crimes committed in the name of progress. The victims he'd created would have justice through policy changes and corporate dismantlement, but they'd never hear him admit culpability or express regret for suffering he'd engineered. What happens to them? Kate gestured toward Atlas's family, still clustered around Epsilon's shrouded form. Classified witness protection while congressional investigations proceed. They'll be secured in federal facilities with appropriate... No. Marcus's voice carried across the clearing with finality that stopped Hayes mid-sentence. Absolutely not. You're not putting them in cages again. Mr. Webb, these beings represent unprecedented biological discoveries. Multiple agencies want access for study. They're people. Emma stepped forward despite Marcus's attempt to hold her back, facing the colonel with courage that made her father's protective instincts war with pride. Epsilon died protecting me. Beta comforted me when I was scared. They're not discoveries or assets. They're a family. Hayes studied the girl, conflict visible in features that suggested he'd spent career following orders regardless of personal opinion. But Emma's testimony carried weight his training hadn't prepared him to dismiss. She'd been Genesis' prisoner, forced to undergo psychological torture while measuring her emotional responses. Her assessment of cryptid personhood came from intimate experience rather than theoretical debate. The law doesn't recognize non-human consciousness as, then the law is wrong. Kate moved to stand beside Emma, presenting united front that included the child Genesis had traumatized and the woman Genesis had transformed without consent. Epsilon demonstrated self-sacrifice to save others. Beta protected a human child at personal cost. Atlas coordinated escape and rescue despite being tortured for months. If consciousness means anything, it means recognizing these beings possess it completely. Hayes's radio crackled with incoming transmission. He stepped away to receive privately. Kate watched him listen, expression shifting through surprise towards something approaching resignation. When he returned, his posture had changed subtly. That was Pentagon Command. Genesis files you uploaded include documentation of Defense Department contracts. Senators are already demanding investigations into how military funding supported illegal genetic experiments. He paused, measuring his next words. Orders have changed. You are not being detained. None of you. Marcus's eyes narrowed. What changed? Political reality. Holding you makes the military complicit in Genesis operations. Releasing you makes us look like we're cooperating with congressional oversight. Hayes gestured toward his soldiers. You're free to go, but understand, other agencies will come looking. Genesis wasn't the only organization conducting cryptid research. The implication crystallized with sickening clarity. Kate had destroyed one company, but Hayes was suggesting the problem extended beyond corporate boundaries into government programs that would continue regardless of Genesis's collapse. How many others? Hayes pulled up files on his tablet, displaying logos Kate recognized from biotech industry conferences and classified research partnerships. 7 major operations that we know about: Project Renaissance, Project Lazarus, Project Titan, all using cryptid DNA for various applications ranging from regenerative medicine to enhanced combat performance. Kate's regeneration genes suddenly felt less like personal miracle and more like blueprint others would replicate regardless of ethical cost. Genesis had failed to recreate Subject Zero success, but 7 other programs meant 7 more opportunities for researchers to perfect hybridization protocols. They'll come for me, for Atlas's family. We're proof it works. Eventually. Hayes met her eyes with surprising directness, which is why I'm giving you 48 hours before I report your location. Get somewhere they can't find you easily. Marcus stepped forward, still holding Emma close. Why help us? Because I have a daughter your age. Hayes glanced at Emma, seeing his own child in her electrode burns and haunted expression. I've spent 20 years following orders, telling myself the mission justified the methods. Watching your daughter testify just reminded me that some orders deserve disobedience. He produced keys to a military transport truck parked beyond the helicopter, pressing them into Marcus's palm. Supplies in the back, medical gear, food, winter equipment. Head north, deep wilderness. I'll report the truck stolen during chaos of Lab Omega's collapse. Kate accepted the gesture while calculating its insufficiency. 48 hours would place them perhaps 200 miles into mountain ranges that might delay pursuit but wouldn't prevent it indefinitely. Eventually, Project Titan or Renaissance or Lazarus would locate them through methods Genesis had pioneered. Atlas approached Hayes slowly, towering over the colonel but moving with careful deliberation that suggested awareness of how threatening it appeared. The cryptid extended one massive hand, not aggressive but offering gesture that transcended species. gratitude between beings who understood sacrifice and unexpected mercy. Hayes shook Atlas's hand with visible discomfort that gradually transformed into something approaching acceptance. When he pulled away, his expression carried the kind of realization that arrived when abstract concepts crystallized into personal understanding. He'd just shaken hands with being military contracts classified as asset, sharing moment of recognition that couldn't be documented in reports or explained to superiors who'd never stood in valley watching Cryptid mourn its mother. They loaded Epsilon's body into the transport with reverence that felt inadequate for being who'd sacrificed everything to save her family. Beta rode in back with the matriarch, refusing to leave despite pregnancy that made the journey uncomfortable. Gamma and Delta positioned themselves protectively, creating barrier between Epsilon and anyone who might disturb final vigil. Emma climbed into the front beside her father, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline that had sustained her through rescue and facility destruction. Marcus started the engine while Kate studied maps Hayes had included with supplies, plotting routes through terrain that might offer sanctuary until they determined more permanent solutions. Atlas took position in the truck bed, despite cold that would have killed unprotected humans within hours. The cryptid's physiology adapted to temperature extremes Genesis had exploited during captivity, and now those same adaptations enabled it to serve as guardian during transport. They drove north as dawn painted mountains and shades that made destruction behind them seem distant and almost beautiful. Hayes watched them depart with expression, suggesting he understood his career had just ended through choices that felt more correct than any order he'd followed previously. The valley disappeared behind ridgelines as they climbed toward elevations where civilization thinned into scattered outposts populated by people who'd chosen isolation over convenience. Kate recognized the territory from her years hiding after leaving Genesis, landscapes that offered protection to anyone willing to endure hardship in exchange for privacy. Emma slept against Marcus's shoulder, breathing steady enough to suggest her body was processing trauma Genesis had inflicted. Marcus drove with single-minded focus, knuckles white on steering wheel, jaw clenched against emotions he couldn't afford to express, while his daughter needed him stable. Kate broke the silence after 2 hours. "I'm sorry I brought this into your life." Marcus's response emerged after a long pause. "You didn't bring it. Genesis did. You just gave us chance to fight back. Emma will carry scars. Emma's alive because you came back." His voice cracked slightly before steadying. "I thought I was protecting her by staying quiet, following orders, pretending I didn't see Genesis' horrors. Instead, I made her target. You taught me that silence isn't safety, it's complicity." They stopped at abandoned ranger station Kate had used during her wilderness years, structure still intact despite years without maintenance. Atlas's family emerged from the truck carefully, Beta moving slowly as pregnancy complicated mobility. Gamma helped Delta unload supplies while Kate assessed the building's condition. The station would suffice for immediate shelter while they planned next moves. Solar panels Kate had installed during her residence still functioned, providing enough power for basic necessities. Water pump connected to underground spring remained operational. The building could house them temporarily, though long-term sanctuary required deeper wilderness than roads could access. Emma woke as Marcus carried her inside, blinking against sunlight streaming through windows Kate had boarded over years ago. The girl's first words emerged soft but clear. "Can we stay here?" Marcus set her down gently, crouching to meet her eyes at level that acknowledged she deserved honest answers. "For now, until we find somewhere safer. Somewhere they can't find us." Emma glanced toward Atlas's family, understanding flowing from traumatic education Genesis had provided. "They'll keep coming, won't they?" Kate wanted to lie, to offer reassurance that would comfort child who'd already endured enough truth for a lifetime. But Emma deserved respect that came from treating her as intelligent survivor, rather than helpless victim. "Yes, other organizations will try what Genesis attempted. We destroyed one company, but the research Hayes mentioned means cryptid DNA is valuable to people with resources for long hunts. Then we have to keep moving." Emma's voice carried resignation beyond her years. "Like refugees." The parallel struck Kate hard. They were refugees, displaced by corporate greed and governmental complicity into existence defined by flight from forces that viewed their lives as means rather than ends. Emma had joined that category through her father's conscience, and now the child understood she'd traded normal childhood for perpetual vigilance. Beta approached Emma slowly, moving with careful deliberation that suggested awareness of how pregnancy made her appear more threatening. The cryptid extended one massive hand palm up, offering comfort through gesture that required no translation. Emma took the hand without hesitation, small fingers disappearing into Beta's gentle grip. Your baby will be born running too. That's not fair. Beta's expression suggested agreement that transcended language barriers. The cryptid's unborn child would enter a world where existing meant evading capture by humans who viewed consciousness as property and suffering as acceptable research cost. No nursery waiting, no secure future, just flight into wilderness that might offer temporary sanctuary before next threat materialized. Atlas joined them, gesturing with complex hand motions Kate recognized as sign language Epsilon had taught. The creature spelled coordinates numerically, then drew rough map in dust coating the ranger station floor. Mountains, valleys, specific landmarks that suggested destination known through inherited knowledge rather than personal experience. Marcus studied the map, comparing it against topographical charts Hayes had included. That's 200 miles north, deep backcountry, no roads for the last 70 miles. Atlas nodded, continuing to sign with patience that suggested this information carried critical importance. Gamma and Delta watched intently, clearly understanding their siblings' communication even if Kate couldn't parse every gesture. Emma pulled out her phone, battery nearly dead but GPS still functional. She entered coordinates Atlas had indicated, then showed Kate the satellite imagery that appeared. Dense forest, steep terrain, no visible human structures within 50 square miles. He's leading us somewhere specific. Kate enhanced the image, studying geological features that suggested natural caves and water sources. The location offered everything necessary for sustained habitation if they could reach it before pursuit caught up. But 70 miles through mountain wilderness with pregnant Beta and traumatized Emma represented challenges that couldn't be solved through determination alone. Marcus assessed their supplies with professional efficiency. We have food for 3 weeks, medical gear, winter clothing, weapons if necessary. But Beta can't handle that terrain, not this late in pregnancy. Beta placed hand on her swollen belly, then made fist over heart in gesture that needed no interpretation. She would endure whatever necessary to reach destination Atlas had indicated. Pregnancy complications be damned. The family had survived Genesis captivity. They'd survived mountain crossing that might damage but wouldn't kill. Kate recognized the determination, having felt it herself during years alone in wilderness when injury or illness should have ended her. Regeneration genes had saved her repeatedly, healing wounds that would have killed normal humans. Beta possessed similar capabilities, though pregnancy strained resources healing allocated elsewhere. We rest today, leave at dawn tomorrow. Kate began organizing supplies with systematic precision. Marcus, you and Emma take the bedroom. I'll coordinate with Atlas's family, determine what they need that we can provide. Emma pulled her father aside, whispering urgently enough that Kate heard fragments despite attempt at privacy. Dad, I want to help. Don't make me sit back while everyone else works. Marcus's response carried parental instinct toward protection, warring with understanding that his daughter had already proven capable of extraordinary courage. Honey, you've been through trauma. So have they. Emma pointed toward Atlas's family, and they're not stopping. Neither should I. The child's logic defeated Marcus's objections through simple accuracy. Everyone present carried trauma Genesis had inflicted. Allowing Emma to participate in their survival honored her experiences rather than infantilizing her through excessive protection. Kate spent afternoon teaching Emma basic wilderness medicine, showing her how to treat injuries they'd likely encountered during mountain crossing. The girl learned with focus that suggested she'd inherited her father's capacity for operating under pressure, asking questions that demonstrated genuine comprehension rather than polite engagement. Beta watched the lesson with interest, occasionally gesturing questions that Kate translated through context and patience. The cryptid wanted to understand human medical practices, perhaps planning for childbirth that would occur without experienced midwives or sterile facilities. Kate found herself discussing pregnancy complications with being whose physiology she barely understood, improvising solutions based on principles that might not apply across species boundaries. Atlas and Gamma disappeared into forests surrounding the ranger station, returning with fresh game that suggested hunting capabilities Genesis had never properly documented. They shared the meat freely, offering portions to Kate, Marcus, and Emma without expectation of reciprocation. Delta helped prepare the food, juvenile enthusiasm providing levity that afternoon desperately needed. They ate together as shadows lengthened and temperature dropped toward freezing that would settle once sun disappeared completely. Emma sat between Beta and Atlas, conversing through gestures and expressions that required no shared language. Kate watched the child forming bonds with beings Genesis had classified as research specimens. Seeing evidence of connection crosses empathy, testing had tried but failed to quantify properly. Emma deserved this, Kate realized. After days of psychological torture measuring her capacity for compassion, the girl needed opportunity to exercise that compassion freely without scientists recording data or calculating future exploitation methods. She was learning that empathy wasn't weakness to be measured, but strength to be celebrated. Night brought cold that drove them inside where solar-powered heaters struggled to maintain livable temperature. Atlas's family huddled together in the main room, body heat combining to create microclimate that proved more effective than technology. They invited Emma into their warmth, and the child accepted without hesitation despite her father's visible concern. Kate stood watch at the window, scanning darkness for pursuit she knew would eventually materialize. Hayes had given them 48 hours. Half that time had already elapsed in travel and rest that couldn't be avoided. Tomorrow they'd begin trek into wilderness, racing against deadline that would expire regardless of whether they reached safety. Marcus joined her vigil, rifle resting across his lap. Think Hayes will keep his word? Yes, but others won't wait for his report. Kate thought about the 7 programs Hayes had mentioned, organizations with resources and motivation to locate them. Project Titan probably has intelligence sources inside military command. They'll know we're free within hours. Then we're operating on borrowed time. We've been operating on borrowed time since the moment you helped Atlas escape. Kate met his eyes, seeing acceptance there. Cross took Emma to punish your disobedience. Other organizations will view us as threats requiring elimination or assets requiring acquisition. Either way, we can't stop moving until we find sanctuary they can't penetrate. If such sanctuary exists. Atlas seems to believe it does. Kate gestured toward the cryptid, currently serving as living pillow for Emma's exhausted form. Epsilon passed knowledge before dying. Those coordinates represent more than random wilderness. Its destination with significance. Marcus studied the creature holding his daughter with gentleness that contradicted every military briefing he'd received about cryptid threat levels. You think there are more of them, a community? Epsilon was elderly. Beta is pregnant. They reproduce, which means population beyond 5 captive specimens. Genesis found 1 family. Probability suggests others exist, hidden deeply enough that decades of human expansion haven't discovered them. The implication carried hope Kate hadn't allowed herself to feel since leaving Genesis 3 years ago. If cryptid populations persisted despite human encroachment, then Atlas's family wouldn't face extinction through corporate exploitation. They could reunite with their own kind, disappearing into societies that had survived centuries without human knowledge. But that reunion required reaching coordinates Atlas had indicated, and 200 miles of mountain wilderness stood between present location and potential sanctuary. Dawn arrived with frost so heavy it resembled snow, transforming landscape into white cathedral that made their departure feel ceremonial. They loaded the truck with supplies they'd need for the journey, abandoning everything non-essential to lighten load. Beta insisted on walking beside the vehicle rather than riding, either preserving space or unwilling to separate from Earth during late pregnancy. Emma packed her belongings with efficiency that suggested she understood possessions mattered less than mobility. She kept only clothing, basic necessities, and photograph of her mother that Marcus had managed to preserve through years of single parenthood. Everything else got abandoned in Ranger Station that would stand empty until next refugees needed shelter. They drove until the road ended in washed-out bridge that would require 4-wheel drive vehicles to cross. Beyond that point, wilderness began in earnest. No trails, no structures, nothing except mountains and the families desperate enough to hide within them. Atlas took point, moving with confidence that suggested inherited maps guiding its path. Gamma assisted Beta across difficult terrain while Delta ranged ahead, scouting for obstacles that might require circumventing. Kate, Marcus, and Emma followed, carrying packs weighted with supplies that grew heavier with each mile covered. The first day's march covered 12 miles before exhaustion forced them to stop. They camped in Cave Atlas located, building fire that might attract attention, but provided necessary warmth against temperatures that dropped well below freezing overnight. Beta's breathing had grown labored, pregnancy making the journey more difficult than pride allowed her to admit. Emma helped Kate prepare simple meal from freeze-dried rations, working with competence that suggested she'd process trauma into determination. The girl no longer flinched when Atlas moved near her, no longer hesitated before touching cryptids whose presence had initially triggered fear. "Miss Kate, can I ask you something?" Kate nodded while stirring pot of rehydrated vegetables. "Do you regret working for Genesis, creating Atlas and the others?" The question deserved honesty, despite complexity it demanded. Kate stirred in silence while assembling answer that wouldn't minimize her culpability or exaggerate her agency. "I regret not asking harder questions about where genetic samples came from. I regret believing Cross when he said we were developing medical treatments. I regret that my research enabled suffering I never intended but should have anticipated." She met Emma's eyes directly. "But I don't regret that Atlas exists. Only that existence came through cruelty rather than choice." Emma absorbed this quietly. "Dad says sometimes we can't undo mistakes. Only try to do better going forward." "Your father is correct." Kate added salt to the pot, watching Emma's profile in firelight. "Genesis transformed me into hybrid without my informed consent. I could spend remaining life angry about violation of my autonomy, or I can use what I've become to prevent others from suffering similar exploitation. Which one are you choosing?" "Both. I'm angry and purposeful. The anger fuels the purpose." Emma smiled slightly, expression carrying wisdom beyond her years. "Epsilon was angry too. I could see it in her eyes when guards hurt her. But she chose to protect me instead of attacking them. Her anger became my safety." Kate pulled Emma close, feeling the child's weight against her side. "You're very brave. Braver than most adults I've known." "I don't feel brave. I feel scared all the time. Bravery is an absence of fear. It's continuing despite fear paralyzing you." Kate stirred the pot again, checking if vegetables had softened sufficiently. "You watched Epsilon suffer. You endured Genesis testing, measuring your empathy. You walked out of that facility and immediately chose to help the beings who'd protected you. That's courage, regardless of how frightened you felt." Emma leaned into the embrace, and Kate felt trembling that suggested the girl had been holding herself together through force of will. Now, momentarily safe and warm, Emma allowed herself to feel the terror she'd been suppressing. They held each other while dinner cooked, and Marcus maintained watch, and Atlas's family rested from days' exertions. The moment stretched into something Kate hadn't experienced since losing everything to Genesis. Family, forged not through genetics, but through shared survival and mutual protection. The next 4 days blurred into exhausting routine of hiking, camping, treating blisters and minor injuries that accumulated despite careful navigation. Beta's condition worsened progressively, and by the 5th morning, she could barely walk without assistance. Kate examined her as thoroughly as possible given limited equipment and complete ignorance of cryptid physiology. "She's in early labor. Stress from the journey triggered it." Marcus's expression went grim. "We're still 40 miles from Atlas's coordinates. She can't make it that far if she's giving birth." Atlas knelt beside Beta, touching her swollen belly with tenderness that conveyed both fear and determination. Gamma and Delta pressed close, offering physical support their pregnant family member desperately needed. Emma approached carefully. "Can we deliver the baby here?" Kate considered options that ranged from inadequate to impossible. They occupied clearing with minimal shelter, supplies designed for travel rather than childbirth, and no knowledge of cryptid obstetrics beyond assumptions based on human pregnancy. Delivering Beta's baby here might save the infant, but could kill the mother through complications Kate wouldn't recognize until too late. But continuing toward Atlas's coordinates while Beta labored risked both lives through exposure and exhaustion. "We deliver here. Marcus, I need you to build better shelter. Emma, Help me prepare medical supplies. They worked with frantic efficiency, constructing lean-to from emergency tarps, while Kate sterilized equipment and prayed she remembered enough obstetric procedures from medical school rotations decades ago. Beta's contractions intensified throughout the afternoon, and by sunset she was clearly suffering, despite attempts to hide pain from family watching helplessly. Atlas held Beta's hand through contractions that shook her massive frame, offering comfort through presence since no one present understood her physiology well enough to ease her agony. Gamma and Delta maintained vigilant watch, protecting their vulnerable family from threats that might exploit Beta's incapacity. Night brought complications Kate had feared, bleeding excessive enough to suggest hemorrhage that would kill Beta within hours without intervention. She worked desperately, using equipment designed for human emergencies on anatomy she barely understood, improvising solutions based on principles that might not apply. Emma held flashlight steady despite her own exhaustion, providing illumination Kate needed to see what she was doing. Marcus stood guard with rifle, ready to defend their makeshift birthing center from any threat attracted by Beta's cries. Hours blurred into agonizing uncertainty until sudden infant wailing announced arrival Kate wasn't sure would occur. Beta cradled her newborn with exhausted relief, crimson-stained but alive. The baby appeared healthy despite premature delivery, already demonstrating impressive strength as it nursed from its mother. Atlas touched the infant with shaking fingers, awe transforming its features into something that made Kate's throat tighten. New life emerging from context of so much death and suffering represented hope she'd stopped believing possible. Emma approached the baby slowly, asking silent permission that Beta granted through tired nod. The girl reached out, touching tiny hand that closed around her finger with grip that suggested future strength. She's perfect. Kate cleaned up bloody supplies while exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her remaining consciousness. They delivered Cryptid infant in mountain wilderness using improvised equipment and zero proper training. The baby survived, Beta survived, and somehow they'd managed medical miracle that should have been impossible. They rested for 2 days, allowing Beta to recover enough strength for continued travel. The new mother refused to wait longer despite Kate's concerns, understanding that every hour delayed meant increased risk of discovery. She could carry her infant and walk simultaneously. That would suffice. The final 30 miles passed an exhausted blur of climbing, resting, treating injuries that accumulated faster than healing could resolve. Emma's feet bled inside boots, Marcus's shoulders bore bruises from pack straps, and Kate's regeneration genes worked overtime repairing damage accumulated through 5 days of brutal hiking. But Atlas's determination never wavered. The Cryptid pressed forward, driven by inherited knowledge that sanctuary waited ahead if they could endure until reaching it. On the 7th day, they crested a ridge and Atlas stopped suddenly, entire body going rigid. Below them, hidden valleys spread across landscape that had somehow escaped human detection. Structures built into rock faces, gardens cultivated despite elevation, smoke rising from chimneys that suggested habitation, and dozens of cryptids moving through the valley with ease that spoke to generations living undisturbed. Atlas roared greeting that echoed across the valley, and answering calls rose from below. Cryptids emerged from structures, looking up toward the ridge where Atlas's family stood silhouetted against Swan. Emma's voice emerged in a whisper that carried absolute wonder. They're not alone. They were never alone. The valley cryptids approached slowly, surrounding Atlas's family with embraces and vocalizations that conveyed joy at reunion. Elderly individuals examined Epsilon's absence with expressions that suggested they'd known and mourned the matriarch. Young ones approached Emma cautiously, curious about the human child arriving in their sanctuary. One elder cryptid separated from the group, approaching Kate directly. It moved with authority that suggested leadership, and when it reached her, it extended hand in gesture that mirrored Hayes's farewell. Kate shook the offered hand, meeting eyes that held intelligence equal to her own. The elder cryptid signed with practiced fluidity. Epsilon spoke of you, said you were different, human with cryptid soul. Kate's throat tightened. I helped create the prison she died escaping, and you helped destroy it. The elder's signing continued with patient clarity. That is enough. The cryptid community absorbed Atlas's family with efficiency, suggesting they'd welcomed refugees before. Beta and her infant received immediate attention from individuals clearly experienced in childcare. Gamma and Delta were guided towards structures where they could rest properly for the first time since captivity began. Atlas remained beside Kate, reluctant to abandon the humans who'd helped liberate them. Marcus pulled Kate aside, voice low. "We can't stay here. Our presence endangers them." "I know." Kate studied the valley, counting perhaps 40 cryptids total. Significant population, but vulnerable if government programs located them. Project Titan will eventually trace our path. When they do, this entire community becomes target. Then we lead them away, draw pursuit back towards civilization. The logic was sound but felt like abandoning mission halfway complete. They'd saved Atlas's family only to leave them vulnerable to the next organization that viewed cryptid DNA as valuable commodity. Emma approached, having overheard their conversation. "What if we didn't run? What if we fought?" Kate and Marcus exchanged glances. "Honey, we're three people against government agencies with unlimited resources. We're three people with evidence that destroys those agencies' credibility." Miss Kate uploaded Genesis files. "Everyone knows about the experiments now. Public opinion matters." The child's insights struck with unexpected force. Emma was suggesting they weaponize transparency rather than hiding in wilderness forever. If they could keep Project Titan's activities public, force congressional oversight, then cryptid communities might achieve protection through political pressure rather than geographical isolation. That means testifying, hearings, becoming public figures who can't disappear. Marcus's voice carried understanding of cost that strategy demanded. "Emma, your face would be everywhere. No more privacy. No more normal childhood. Normal ended when Genesis kidnapped me. At least this way, Epsilon's death means something beyond our survival." Kate studied the girl, seeing determination that reminded her of herself decades ago, before Genesis had taught her that good intentions couldn't overcome institutional evil. Emma still believed systems could be reformed, that exposing corruption would trigger justice rather than more sophisticated concealment. Maybe the child's optimism deserves support rather than cynical dismissal. If we testify publicly, other organizations will target us aggressively. Not just capture, but elimination. We become threats requiring permanent removal. Emma's jaw set with resolution beyond her years. Then we make ourselves too visible to kill quietly. Media attention, congressional protection, public advocacy. They can't disappear people when millions are watching. Marcus looked at his daughter with expression mixing pride and terror. "You understand, this means we can never stop. No retiring from activism. No quiet life afterward." Epsilon couldn't stop either. She fought until she died, giving us chance to escape. Least I can do is use that chance fighting for the community she saved. Kate felt something shift in her chest, recognition that Emma represented everything Genesis had tried to destroy. Empathy weaponized not against victims, but against perpetrators. The girl had endured psychological torture, measuring her compassion, and now she was proposing to transform that compassion into political force that might actually protect beings who'd shielded her. "All right, we testify, but we do it strategically." Kate began planning while exhaustion made thinking difficult. Congressional hearings first, establishing official record, then media campaign, building public awareness. Finally, legislative advocacy, pushing for cryptid rights protections. And when Project Titan comes for us, we make sure cameras are rolling when they arrive. They spent 3 days in the valley, recovering from the journey while preparing for the war that would follow their decision to fight publicly rather than hide permanently. The cryptid community provided shelter, food, and medical care that exceeded anything Kate had expected from population living without modern technology. The elder cryptid, whose name translated roughly as mountain heart, explained their survival strategy through signing and gestures Kate learned to interpret. They'd lived hidden for generations, avoiding human contact while monitoring civilization's expansion with careful attention. Genesis had discovered Epsilon's family through unfortunate chance, but the valley community remained unknown because they maintained strict isolation protocols. Kate's presence represented the first time they'd welcomed humans into their sanctuary. Decision Mountain Heart had made specifically because Epsilon's final communication had vouched for Kate's character before the matriarch's death. On the fourth day, they prepared to depart. Atlas and its family would remain in the valley, raising Beta's infant in community that could provide protection Kate couldn't offer. The separation felt more painful than Kate had anticipated, having bonded with the cryptids through trauma that forged connection deeper than species difference. Emma embraced Atlas carefully, the child barely reaching the cryptid's chest. "Thank you for saving me, for protecting me when you didn't have to." Atlas knelt, bringing its face level with Emma's, and signed slowly. "You protected us too, by choosing to fight." They left the valley at dawn, hiking back towards civilization with purpose that felt entirely different from their flight into wilderness. Now they moved toward confrontation rather than away from it, armed with evidence and determination that might actually matter in public forums Genesis had never needed to consider. Hayes met them at the ranger station exactly 48 hours after his promised deadline, arriving with soldiers but no restraints. His expression suggested he'd expected them to run farther, rather than circling back. "Dr. Morrison, I underestimated you." "Most people do." Kate handed him a tablet containing comprehensive documentation of their journey, evidence that would support testimony while protecting the valley's location through strategic omissions. "We're ready to testify. Congressional hearings, media interviews, whatever achieves maximum public exposure." Hayes studied the tablet, scrolling through files with expression that cycled between respect and concern. "You understand Project Titan and others will view this as declaration of war? Public testimony makes you permanent targets. Then we'll be targets worth protecting." Kate met his eyes steadily. Epsilon died buying her family's freedom. "I plan to ensure her sacrifice achieves systemic change, not just temporary safety." Hayes nodded slowly, respect evident despite his military training, suggesting he should discourage civilian interference in classified programs. "I'll arrange secure transport to Washington. Congressional oversight committees will want you there within 72 hours. They flew to Washington in military transport, watching mountains shrink below them as civilization expanded across the landscape. Emma pressed against the window, studying geography that represented battleground they'd chosen to enter. The girl's voice emerged quiet but determined. "Miss Kate, do you think we'll win?" Kate considered lying, offering reassurance that would comfort child who had already been lied to extensively by adults claiming authority. But Emma deserved truth, however uncertain. "I think we'll fight with everything we have. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it isn't. But the fighting matters regardless of outcome." Emma nodded, accepting the ambiguity that came with battles waged against forces larger than individual will. She'd survived Genesis' captivity. She'd witnessed Epsilon's sacrifice. She'd walked 200 miles through mountain wilderness to reach sanctuary. Whatever came next, the girl had already proven herself capable of enduring while maintaining compassion that Genesis had tried to quantify and failed to destroy. They landed in Washington as sunset painted the capital in shades that made monuments appear fragile despite marble construction. Kate stepped onto tarmac with full understanding that she'd crossed threshold into conflict that would define remaining decades of her life. But Atlas's family was safe. Emma had chosen purpose over trauma. And somewhere in Hidden Valley, a cryptid infant was learning to walk in community that had survived despite centuries of human expansion. That felt worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost the battle demanded.
Okay.
Ist unten schon reingegangen, ja.
Ja, der Mix kam ja auch mit da.
Lass mal schnell
war noch
B
late
machen.
in
Lass mal schnell B machen. Ich mach meine Wand verzögert. Du gehst einfach hier hin, Cranky, Drohns und dann überrennen wir die einfach. Let's go.
Jemand Jet und Rainer was zusammen.
Und vielleicht kannst du noch, May, vielleicht kannst du noch einen Fake-Vogel schicken, damit die sich wegdrehen von allem.
Ein Fake-Vogel.
Ja, komm mal nicht, geh mal bitte nicht Window, komm mal bitte mit hierher. Mach einfach einen Fake-Vogel, dass die sich wegdrehen von der Drohne. Und renn da, renn da, renn da, renn da. Ist langsam.
Oben auf der Wall, auf der Wall!
Renn das hier raus, renn das hier raus. Hinter der Wand. Vorsicht, Wand ist down, Wand ist down. Wand ist down. Renn das close.
Tunnel noch mal Slow.
Ja.
Passt Main auf, passt Main auf. Einer
Ja, ich halte Main, ich halte Main, ich halte Main. Ich halte Main. Alles gut.
Nice.
Hinter dir, Mai.
Winter tot, Winter tot, Winter tot.
So weit CT. So.
Okay. Mach Wall hoch. Noch einer Main, einer Main.
One enemy remaining.
Ist wahrscheinlich Broken Wall raus.
Last player standing.
Tunnel.